All the preachers in this church are following the same themes throughout the month of October, because underlying the unfinished initiative is not the financial, underlying it is the spiritual. It is focusing upon expanding our hearts in unfinished discipleship, because we are all unfinished. And I would always encourage you to make sure that you refer to this book, the booklet, the unfinished booklet. And I believe we have extra copies in the back there if you did not receive it in the mail, but there's a devotional that coincides with each of the Sundays that we have as part of this initiative, focusing upon the parts of our hearts that need to work more on surrendering to God, trusting God, being able to be more sacrificial, and so forth. So continue to refer to this. It's a great booklet. Today, the fourth theme is that of being able to develop a sense of being amazed. And I want to get into that by telling you a couple of stories. First was a man who was a pastor in his 60s, and he was appointed by the bishop to a medium-sized town, to a medium-sized church, sort of with the promise that he could retire from that church. But he quickly discovered that in that church, he had a few of the saints who had the philosophy of, we were here before this preacher, and we'll be here after this preacher. And consequently, he ruffles some feathers, and that was pretty difficult. He had some ups and downs and some problems, and it can be withering what a pastor can experience when you go into the pulpit and you know that some of the people who might have some real difficulties with you are listening to you, not with open ears, but with a pencil and paper. And that's what he encountered. And yet, this old preacher would still, nonetheless, every Sunday get up there and do his best to preach. And one particular Sunday, he preached on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Unbeknownst to him, that there was this 15-year-old kid in the pew absolutely bored to death because his parents dragged him to church. And this 15-year-old kid happened to hear a sentence or two that this preacher said. And it sort of intrigued him. And he went back and he dusted off his King James version of the Bible that he'd gotten in the second grade at the Baptist church. And he read the Sermon on the Mount, and he gave his life to Christ that afternoon. And I know that story to be true because I'm that boy. And I would not be here had it not been for old Dr. Bradford Powell preaching, tired and withered as he was, that sermon on that January Sunday morning. You never know how an insignificant, ordinary, day in, day out thing you might say or do can change a life like that. You might not ever know. And there once was a woman, I'll just call her Florence. Florence is sort of a composite of people I know. I imagine Florence once upon a time woke up with this pounding headache. And usually when she had a headache, she would take 2 Advil, 2 cups of coffee, and everything was fine, but not today. And even when she spent an hour with her grandkids, babysitting and enjoying them, that usually would take care of a headache. Not today. The kids were especially energetic, shall we say, and the headache persisted. Had a doctor's appointment that was supposed to be early afternoon, it dragged into middle afternoon because the doctor was running late. And so she came home and she had to do the one thing that she hadn't started, but she'd promised to do it, and that was to make a casserole for a family that had tragically lost a husband and a father. She almost called and said, "I'm sorry, I can't do it." But she promised. She called and said, "I'm going to be late, but I'll be there." So with her head pounding, she got all the ingredients, did the casserole thing, and brought it over to the family, and they received it gratefully and with smiles. And she went back home. And Florence would never, ever, ever know that decades later, the teenage daughter that was in that family would talk about how such people in this church embodied what Christ's love was all about during the darkest time at the family. And she, this now grown daughter, would talk about raising her own children in this church, always remembering the casserole brigade, a sign of Christ's love. Isn't it funny how insignificant things that you say or do can impact lives in a profound way? There once was a time when a little boy had a little lunch. Well, let's just see what happened with that. I won't tell the story. Let's let someone by the name of John in the New Testament tell it. In honor of what you're about to hear, would you please stand?
Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him. He asked Philip, "Where will we buy food to feed these people?" Jesus said this to test him because he already knew what he was going to do. Philip said, "More than half a year's salary worth of food won't be enough for each person to have even a little bit." One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "A youth here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that for a crowd like this?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass there. They sat down, about 5,000 of them. Then Jesus took the bread. When he had given thanks, he distributed it to those who were sitting down. He did the same with the fish, each getting as much as they wanted. When they had plenty to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing will be wasted." So they gathered and filled 12 loaves with the pieces of 5 barley loaves that had been left over from those who had eaten. And when the people saw what had been done, that it was a miraculous sign, they said, "Truly, this is the prophet who is coming into the world." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. Can you imagine that boy? Now, Jesus was the rock star. He was the rock star of that era, of that time, of that location, because word spread, maybe sometimes exaggerated so, maybe not, about the miracles that he did, about his teaching that was not like anybody else. And so this boy had his lunch, and he was determined to weave his way through the crowd so that he could get the equivalent of a box seat. I like to imagine that there he is in the front, and maybe about 10, 15 feet separate him and the crowd from Jesus and the disciples and some of the women who would be around with them as well. And he spreads out his lunch, and he's ready to see the show. And Jesus, before the show begins, looks around at the crowd and says to the disciples, "You know, these friends who have come to us are very hungry. I'd like you to feed them. How much food do you have?" And of course, the disciples, being the calculating people they are, being people like us, would say, "Are you serious, Jesus? Look, there must be 5,000 people here spread all over the hillside, and you're thinking we have the food to feed them? The only food we see here is on the front with that boy. Look, he has on the ground there on that mat, small mat, some fish and some bread. But what is that in the face of so much need?" Now, I could take the sermon off a little tributary here and say, isn't it the way we feel at times? That we have so little to offer Christ. We have so little to offer in this church. We have so little to offer in our relationships or in our connections, right? What good is us volunteering to staff the bridge bread table sometimes, or the unfinished table, or what good is it just to sing in the choir, sometimes when you have time, or what good is it for us to put our commitment here or our offering there? What good is it to volunteer for Habitat or to teach Sunday school, maybe go to a Sunday school class even? What good is something so little in a world that is so divided, that has so much need? Well, I would say, based on the parable, or the story rather, there is a lot of good that can be done with your small gift. But I'm not going that route. I'm going back to another direction in the sermon. So just forget what I said, okay? What I want to focus on is the amazement of that boy, because he's been singled out as he starts to break that barley bread loaf. And Jesus motions for him to come forward. Can you imagine that? Come here. Now, that's something. You're at that concert and you've made your way up to the front, and the star, the rock star, stops everything and says, "You in the front, come on up. You can see the show from the stage." Wow! And so he bundles up his food and he goes up, and Jesus, as only Jesus can, said, "Could I borrow your food for a minute?" And he gives it, and you know what happens. Basket after basket full. Food is distributed. Maybe people share. That's what people have said. Some commentators say maybe this is such a tremendous illustration that people shared their lunches and et cetera. All we know is it's a great miracle, and he is amazed at what he's seen ringside, stage side, right there. And as you see on the screen, so does he believe. Anything you put into Christ's hands turns into a miracle. An old, battered preacher's sermon changes a life. A woman with a headache's casserole changes a life. A boy's lunch changes a life. Anything you put into Christ's hands, Christ turns into a miracle. What we've talked about throughout these weeks of Unfinished is nothing more and is nothing less than painting the scenery of a miracle that Jesus will be doing. Miracles Jesus will be doing within this church and this community. Every so often, every few years, there is something special that God moves us to impact lives. So just imagine. With bread and fish we give, what will Jesus do? Well, there will be a bike in the family that could not afford a bike, and the children will be able to ride to school and maybe ride to part-time jobs. College students might have bikes to ride to jobs as they attend school. And it would never have been possible had we not done a first phase of a mission center so that the bike ministry would not have to refuse donations anymore, but could continue to multiply those donations and start going to the next 6,000 bikes that they will be able to give. It's called a miracle. It's what Jesus does. Or it's like a homebound couple that could not get out but used to be faithful as clockwork in this church. They can't worship with us anymore. They might see a sermon online, that's great, but they miss the choir, they miss other parts. But now there's something called live streaming that will be able to connect with people without the physical limitations. And lives are changed and people are connected. Or there's that youth, feels estranged maybe from his classmates, maybe even from his family, but he has a friend that invites him to a youth group here, and there is new space created for them, reflective of how important the youth of this church are for this ministry, for this church. And he starts making friendships that change his life and turn his direction. That's called a miracle. And time doesn't allow us for the other miracles, such as a gathering place for church and community, or even taking care of a debt, or even taking care of the HVAC of this. Point is, anything you give in Christ's hands turns into a miracle. That's what's exciting about this. As our hearts expand, our eyes are opened, and we see what Jesus is doing as never before. That's why the commitment cards that you have, that you were sent or that you see in the pews, are not an economic exercise. They are, above all else, a spiritual exercise. There are two ways to put bread and fish into Jesus' hands. Two ways. One is what you see on the left side of the commitment card, and I've talked about that before. It's sort of an opportunity for you to ask yourself, where am I? What can I put in Jesus' hands? And I will make sure that you note that when the boy gave his lunch to Jesus, the boy did not keep the bread and the fish next to him and give Jesus the mat where the crumbs were, saying, let's see what you can do with that. No. He gave his whole lunch. What is your lunch? That's a way to look at it. Where are you on that ladder? Don't be ashamed of wherever you are. Be happy with where you are right now to be able to take an intentional look, maybe for the first time, as to what can you place in Jesus' hands. The traditional way to do it is, what do you make in a year? What's your income? You look at that. You really take a look at that, and you move the decimal point that's on the far right one place to the left. That's called a tithe. And you see where you are. 0% instead of 10% of your income. How do you move to 1? How do you move to 3? It's up to you with that. But the biggest thing ever is to be able to look at your budget through the eyes of faith. And I have been so blessed to be able to lead a class on Unfinished on Sunday nights. And there's one young couple there that's talked about their journey throughout this month, about getting to this very point, about looking at their budget through the eyes of faith. We have a little clip from what happened last Sunday night. I'd like you to see it, please.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Kendrith Beebe. This is my fiancée, Sarah Mata. We just want to say thank you to Pastor Greg for even just inviting us to do this, and how much of an honor it is to be able to come up here and talk in front of a bunch of people that we don't know. Honestly, he asked us last week about this, so we thought about putting some cards together or something, but we decided to just wing it. So, yeah, we'll see how this goes. When he asked us to do this, Sarah and I committed without really giving it a second thought, just because of everything that this church has meant to us, and even just our short time here. And when we were thinking about it, it was something that Pastor Greg said actually just now, or repeating just now. It was about planting the tree. So for anybody who missed the service a few weeks ago, he ended with one of his usual deep and thought-provoking statements that we often discuss over pancakes. And he talked about, when is the right time to plant a tree? And many people said the fall, and I didn't know that. I'm not an arborist. But the correct answer was 20 years ago. So we went out to breakfast, and that thought just kind of sat with me for the rest of the day. And as we're starting our family here, when we had this opportunity to come up and speak to you guys, we decided that we wanted this to be our 20 years ago. We want to take this opportunity to plant our seed and nurture our family here through this church, and that's why we picked this place when we were trying to find a home. And this is just going to be such a wonderful opportunity for us to, I'm not even going to call it a donation. For us, this is more of like an investment. It's an investment in the family that we will hopefully have someday. It's an investment in our community, and it's an investment in the wonderful things that we've already gotten to see just by being here.
I'm a little shorter. Just kind of going along with what he said, we're so excited to make this commitment, investment into this church community. We started attending this church back in January. We were looking for a church to join together, and right away it became very clear to us that this was our right place. As he mentioned, we would often discuss all the uplifting ideas that we'd gained from the service over brunch, and we felt that it would just uplift our weeks. It would make us feel so much more inspired, and we just felt so fulfilled. And it became very apparent to us that this was going to be our church. We wanted to join, and we also realized that not only were we gaining something from the church, but we also wanted to give to the church. We, shortly after joining, started to look for ways to reach out, to get involved, to meet people. And this whole opportunity to be part of this church has not only brought us closer to God, it has also brought us closer to each other in a whole new way. And we're just so grateful to be having this opportunity. I know as a, young couple kind of starting out, we have many financial commitments to make, buying a house and a wedding and many other things, and we decided that making a commitment to our church was just as important, if not even more important than anything else in our lives, because this is truly where we're building our family, where we're establishing our roots. So we're just very grateful for the opportunity to make this wonderful investment in this church community. Thank you.
I love it. We have all these expenses, we have all these coming up, but our faith is what's ultimately important. That when you see that couple, think of the boy with the loaves and the fish. It's the same heart, and it's that heart that's important. So think about that as you go through that one way of looking intentionally about what you can give, what you do, what portion of your income you can give joyfully. The second way is something we've referred to before, and that is because we have such an ambitious goal of what we are seeing Jesus doing here, funded means that we dip into our resources. Stored resources, they call it, savings, stocks, mutual funds, inheritances, IRAs, additional streams of income, selling that boat that you've used twice in 20 years, that type of stuff. And that's sort of traditional. And there's a side on the pledge card for you to be able to do that and to figure that up. That's really ultimately important as we put the full loaves and fish in Jesus' hands. But this is where I struggle. And I'm going to admit that right up here. Because there's one thing, and my wife and I, our family, we tithe. We go over the tithe with the way we have through the years done that. But my savings is another matter. I mean, you don't want to mess with those. I am the son of a Depression-era father, so I know how it's important to save, to make sure you don't have ongoing debt other than the house, to really buttress yourself against the unknown. I know that. I could teach Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University. Anybody that had parents living through the Depression could teach that. But also, friends, more important than being the son of a Depression-era father is to be a child of God and to recognize that and to be called to understand that all I've ever been given is an opportunity to give back, to be that kid with the bread and the fish. And that's essentially what I was saying in that event last Sunday night. I found myself lapsing into a sermon, as preachers sometimes do. And as I was saying that, I said, if you have come with your commitment card filled out already, I would ask you to listen to the Spirit, and maybe the Spirit is telling you you can do better than that. And I left it with them. I went back, sat down next to my wife, and then I thought, I can do better than that. And sometimes I'm too inspiring for my own good. We took our envelope, we opened it up, and we increased our giving from our saved resources. And my first reaction was, because it hurts. And then my second reaction was, I just heard Kendrith and Sarah. I've worked on the sermon with the boy, the loaves, and the fish. I've been blessed. I want this to bless others. And Jesus shall, through what we give, through what you give, because it's not a duty as much as it's an opportunity to see Jesus do a miracle, not just in changing lives, but in the process of bringing the commitments back next week. In the midst of the joy, we understand that one of the biggest miracles we'll take away is what Jesus does within our hearts. Look forward to that.